Hi, and welcome back to the writing session for words and spacing. In this session, I'm going to use Microsoft Word to show you some of the things that we talked about in the last lecture on words and spacing. Now, we're going to begin first with kind of how to lay things out in Word. Note that if you're using some other application, Google Docs, OpenOffice, things like that, that it should be similar. It's just that you got to find the magic menu incantation to get there. So in Word, the incantation is to go to Layout, and under that, you'll see Margins. Here we want to have 1-inch margins all around. This is the default that typically comes up. Now I actually do 0.75 margins all around when publishing on CreateSpace just to get a little bit more room. And it's kind of the minimum that you can have if you do them all around. You can have smaller margins on the inside than the outside, but I like to have the same all around. It's easier to set. So typically set to normal. When I'm going with CreateSpace, I set to 0.75, and you'll actually see the cursor here jump closer to the edge because of that when I set that. So let's set it back to 1 inch, the typical standard that everybody uses for spacing. The other thing that you can set on this menu ribbon is hyphenation, and we want hyphenation none. We want no auto hyphenation. The final thing is when we go to Home, we can set that this is going to be left justified. Don't do full justification. That's when you'll start getting weird spaces put in there to try and justify left and right. It's better to have left justified with a ragged right edge. So this is the way you select that. And here we're ready to write. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to write a sentence. Remember that a sentence begins with a capitalized first word and ends with a period. So let's write a short sentence. There we go. This is a short sentence. And it begins with a capital this, and it ends with a period. Now, if we're going to have another sentence after this, we have the option here of having one space, which is more typical nowadays, but the traditional one was to have 2 spaces. And if I do that and write another sentence, there, this is another sentence, then notice that I don't get any type of an error for having multiple spaces here or for having just one if I change it to 1. But if I try and take words and put multiple spaces in between, it should actually complain to me that I've got 2 spaces here. This is not what you do to separate words. You use 1 space in between. The only place you can use 2 spaces is between sentences. There we go. So I repeated a couple sentences so that we can see that our paragraphs here are left justified. To create a new paragraph, you just go to the end of the sentence at which you'd like to start a new paragraph and press return. Notice that I didn't press return here when I made it to the end of the line. I just let Word automatically wrap. And we can see here that paragraphs are by default being separated by 1 blank line. We can also separate them by having indents instead of 1 blank line. Now, rather than going or basically entering 5 manual spaces or even a tab, what you should do in Word is configure Word to give you an indent instead of a blank line for a paragraph. Let me show you how that's done. Let's get rid of these 5 spaces I added. And we'll go up to Word's styles. Styles are the way you configure the way things look in Word. So I'm going to go to Home, and here are our styles. We can see that this is a normal style, since it's highlighted with a gray box around it, for this paragraph. Normal is kind of your base style for all normal sentences. Now I'm going to go to it and right-click, and up comes Modify in the context menu. And when I select Modify, I can now select how this thing is going to be configured. Specifically, I can go to Format Paragraph, and I can say no 8 spaces after. And this is what's giving us that blank line And then I go to special and I say first line, indent by, well, actually, instead of 0.5, I like 0.3. And there you go. Now, when I save this and I go ahead and say OK, we can now see that that blank line has gone between paragraphs, and instead I'm getting about a 5-space indent per paragraph. So that's the way to configure paragraph indenting in sentences. Let's look at some other things, like the use of apostrophes. Here's a sentence that says, I should not hide from my mother. Now this can actually be condensed by getting rid of the space between should and not, getting rid of the O and replacing it with an apostrophe. So it becomes, instead of should not, I shouldn't hide from my mother. This is one way that you can eliminate spaces. Now, what I find in my writing, and this is a style thing, and it has to do with what you're writing about, the style that you're writing, or if this is dialogue, which is identified by putting things in double quotes, then what shouldn't is, instead of should not, is that should not is much more formal. So I should not hide from my mother sounds much more formal than I shouldn't hide from my mother. So if you want casual writing, you should use the condensed or collapsed form using the apostrophe. And if you want something more formal, use should not. That's part of your writing style. There we go. There's a sentence. This is a sample sentence that uses an all-in-all great style of writing. Now notice, all in all, we have hyphenated the words to put them together. This is a word string, so it's another case where your spaces disappear. That's about all that I have really to say about spaces and words for right now. In the next writing session, we're going to look at punctuation, which is going to get a little wilder and a little more interesting. So I'll see you then.